The story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram found in the book of Numbers is one that has puzzled and disturbed many Bible readers over the centuries. Why did God respond with such severe and dramatic judgment against these men, destroying them and their families in such a violent and terrifying way? Sending them alive down into the depths of Sheol, the underworld of the dead? This is certainly one of the more unsettling and troubling incidents recorded in the Old Testament scriptures. Korah was a Levite, a member of the tribe chosen by God to serve as priests and ministers in the tabernacle. The Levites had a special and privileged status among the people of Israel. They were not allotted their own territory like the other tribes, but were dispersed throughout the land, living among the other tribes and serving as spiritual leaders and teachers of the law. The Levites did not have to worry about farming the land or tending flocks and herds like the other tribes. Instead, their sole focus was to be on ministering before the Lord, offering sacrifices, and instructing the people in God's ways. In return, the other tribes were commanded to financially support the Levites through tithes and offerings, ensuring they had what they needed to fulfill their sacred duties. Korah seems to have become discontent and resentful of this arrangement. He began to agitate against the leadership of Moses and Aaron, the high priest. Korah gathered 250 other leaders of the community, men of renown, and confronted Moses and Aaron, accusing them of exalting themselves above the rest of the congregation. "You have gone too far," Korah declared. "For all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" Numbers 16:3. Korah's primary grievance seemed to be that Moses and Aaron had elevated themselves to a special status, claiming authority and prerogatives that rightfully belonged to the entire community. In Korah's view, all the people were holy, and the Lord was present with them all. There was no need for a designated priesthood or leadership. Korah appears to have been resentful of the unique privileges and responsibilities given to the tribe of Levi. He felt that the other tribes were just as qualified and worthy to serve in priestly roles. Perhaps Korah even harbored ambitions of seizing the priesthood for himself and his co-conspirators. Moses responded by challenging Korah and his followers to present themselves before the Lord the next day with censers, ready to offer incense. This would be a test to see whom the Lord had chosen to serve as priests. Moses made it clear that anyone the Lord did not choose would be put to death. The next day, Korah and his 250 companions presented themselves before the tabernacle, ready to offer incense. Meanwhile, Moses instructed the rest of the Israelites to distance themselves from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. As the confrontation reached its climax, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. God declared that he would judge those who had rebelled against his appointed leaders. He then opened up the earth, and it swallowed them up with all that belonged to them. They and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. Numbers 16:33. The text makes it clear that it was not just Korah, Dathan, and Abiram who were destroyed, but all their households, all that belonged to them. This included their wives, children, and possessions. It was a horrific and devastating judgment. But God was not finished. Fire then went out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering the incense, killing them as well. In total, 255 men were destroyed that day for their rebellion against Moses and Aaron. The severity of God's judgment here is truly staggering. Why did he respond with such extreme measures? Was this really warranted, or was God overreacting and being unnecessarily harsh? To understand God's reasoning, we need to look more closely at the nature of Korah's rebellion and the underlying issues at stake. Korah's grievance, at its core, was a rejection of God's own established order and authority. When Korah accused Moses and Aaron of exalting themselves above the assembly of the Lord, he was essentially challenging the divine appointment and authority that God himself had granted to the Levitical priesthood. The role of the Levites, and particularly the high priest Aaron, was not something that Moses had arbitrarily or selfishly claimed for himself. It was a position that God had specifically ordained and commanded. The Levites had been set apart by God for the sacred task of ministering in the tabernacle and serving as intermediaries between the people and the Lord. By rebelling against Moses and Aaron's leadership, Korah was in effect rebelling against God's own established order and authority. He was asserting his own right to determine the proper form of worship and leadership, rather than submitting to God's clear instructions. This was an incredibly serious offense. It struck at the heart of the covenant relationship between God and his people. If the people could simply disregard the divinely appointed leadership whenever they felt it was unfair or unnecessary, the entire theocratic structure that God had established would unravel. The priesthood was a vital component of Israel's identity as the people of God. The Levites were to model holiness and obedience, teaching the people to revere and follow the Lord. If their authority was undermined, it would lead to spiritual chaos and compromise. Korah's rebellion was not just a personal power play, it was a revolt against God's sovereign will and the very foundations of the covenant. This is why God responded with such fierce judgment. He was defending the integrity of his own established order and authority. The text makes it clear that God did not act hastily or rashly. He gave Korah and his co-conspirators an opportunity to present themselves before him, to see if they were truly qualified to serve as priests. This was a direct challenge. If their grievances were legitimate, then God would recognize and affirm their priestly status. But when Korah and the others defiantly presented themselves, it showed that their hearts were hardened in rebellion. They were not seeking to honor God and submit to his will, but to usurp the authority that God had placed in Moses and Aaron. This was a direct denial of God's own sovereign choices and an arrogant assertion of human autonomy. It was a blatant disregard for God's holiness and the proper order of worship that he had established. Such an offense could not be tolerated or overlooked. The language used to describe Korah's judgment is truly chilling. The earth swallowing them up and them going down alive into Sheol speaks of a terrifying, cataclysmic event. They did not simply die a natural death, but were violently thrust into the realm of the dead, the underworld of Sheol. This judgment was not just about removing rebellious individuals from the community. It was a sobering declaration of God's absolute authority and the consequences of defying his established order. The people needed to understand in the most visceral way possible that rebelling against God's appointed leaders was an unthinkable act of treason. And the judgment did not stop there. The 250 men offering incense were also consumed by fire from the Lord. This was a clear vindication of Moses and Aaron's priestly status, as well as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to usurp that role. Taken together, this episode reveals the seriousness with which God views challenges to his authority and the proper order of worship. The Levitical priesthood was a vital component of God's covenant relationship with Israel. To undermine that was to strike at the very heart of the nation's identity and mission. We must also remember the broader context of this event. The Israelites had already demonstrated a troubling pattern of grumbling, complaining, and rebelling against God and his appointed leaders. The exodus from Egypt had been marked by repeated instances of the people losing faith, doubting God's goodness and power, and testing his patience. Just prior to the Korah incident, the people had again rebelled against Moses and Aaron, accusing them of killing off the Lord's people. God had responded by sending a plague that killed thousands. It was only through Aaron's priestly intervention, making atonement for the people, that the plague was stopped.